The paper that I'm talking about today is a paper that I've been using for quite a while. It's Stonehenge Aqua Hot Press, which is made by Legion. This block, it comes in a block in £140, 300 GSM, or you can buy it in sheets as well. And you can buy a heavier weight version, which I've also worked on, which is £275 or 550 GSM. I've done lots of sort of smaller paintings on it, and I've done these sort of regular tests that you'll see on paper, trying out different approaches with grading from dark to light, washes, layering washes, lifting paint, working wet and dropping into wet and painting sharp edges. And these are a lot of the properties that we want to be able to achieve good results with paper. But this type of exercise can have a limited value in that respect, and that it's not the same as making an actual painting. This example here, I've used different types of paint, different brands of paint. So my brand that I usually use is Winsor & Newton here, and it lifts quite well off Winsor & Newton. The paint, this is French Ultramarine, and I've got Daniel Smith, Schminke, M. Graham and Turner there. So I just tried different types of paint on the same paper, and it does make a difference, the type of paint that you use as well on a specific paper. And you can see some differences there between them. So going back to the painting, I worked on a large painting recently on the heavier weight version, and I'm currently working on this flower to try and establish what are the good things and the bad things about this paper. So a few things really. First of all, the surface is very smooth. It handles colour really well. The colour stays vibrant on it. The washes I find a little bit more problematical on it. When you wet the paper, it dries quite quickly off the surface. It doesn't really sink in as much as with other papers, I think, such as Saunders Waterford. So say for example, I've been adding a sort of selective wash area here. Now on a small area it's fine, but on a larger area I tend to find that it dries very quickly. Now it's not a huge problem for me because I'm a pretty dry painter anyway, and I don't use great big washes. I tend to apply my paint a little bit more selectively, and it's fine for an area like that. It'll stay wet long enough for me to work around these sort of central parts of the flower. I can sort of blend and grade quite well with it as well. And one of its big bonuses with it is the edge. The edge on this paper is incredibly smooth, and I think this is a big bonus because with other papers this is not always the case. So I'll wet it first and then drop in the paint, and I can kind of blend it in. I don't want to go too dark with this because these back bracts are paler because they're further away. So you can see it's given me a very sharp edge here. There's no fuzziness or bleeding into the paper. It'll stay very sharp. And also when building up colour and layers, I can go over those edges again and again. Now, one of the things that is frustrating about many papers is that when you put water onto the surface of a paper, it disturbs the sizing on it. Now, I think this has a very hard size because when I rub my finger across the surface, and I know you're not supposed to put your fingers across the surface, but this was painted with this purpose in mind, you can feel the painting. You can feel the surface is rougher on the paint parts than it is on the smooth of the paper, and that's because it's disturbed the sizing and the water has sunk into the paper. Now that sinking into the paper will allow you more working time. This tends to dry on that surface quite quickly, And so you don't get that roughness. So that's on the benefit from not having that sinking in, is that you don't get that raised surface and that roughness. So actually when it comes to painting very sharp lines and edges, there's no resistance at all with the paper. I can paint really smooth edges no matter how much paint I've already put on there. Fine lines. So what happens when you've got a raised surface or too much working on the paper is it becomes rough and you can't get that fine line. On this, there's no issue at all with getting a fine line. It's the same, pretty much the same as it is in the first layers, as when you've got multiple layers on. And that's the same with the veins. If I want to put more veins in and get really nice sharp fine lines. So I tend to work as well quite a lot into damp. So if I want to build up areas, so on this one I want to build this up a little bit more, I'll just dampen the area where I want to build it in. Just going to dampen from there as well. Just adding a little bit more paint there, just maintaining the highlights. Very good for controlling areas, so it's not spreading a lot. When you wet it and drop paint in, it doesn't spread a long way, it stays quite contained. So I work quite a lot into, I say, into damp, and I don't really have to wait for it to dry before I can go back in. So define some of those veins, and it's still actually workable, where I get a softer line into damp than onto dry. And I find that's a really good quality to have in a paper for my particular style of painting. I can also build up saturation of colour working quite dry. So say I want to build up here, so just dampen it a little bit first. So I want to build up a little sort of indent there. I'll work with a very sort of soft stroke, building up colour. Dried off a bit there, so I'm going to add a bit more water to it. I can build up that saturation of colour quite easily. And I can also add glazes over the top of it, no problem. So I don't want this as light as it is there, it's too light. I want to add some glaze to that that's a slightly cooler colour. Still keeping that sharp edge, no problem. I'm building up colour. This is an area where there can be some issues with it, and I didn't discover this initially with it, doing sort of small tests on it. I'll just work straight onto it with a sort of damp, light amount of colour. If you work quite dry like this, it's not an issue. If you start to put lots of water on and try and push things around, it's going to be a problem, because it tends to lift the paint and move it. Now for me that's okay, because I as I say, I work quite dry. I work on vellum too, and it's got similar properties. It doesn't sink into the surface, so it's not got the same working time. But that, on the other hand, has the benefits of the sharpness of the paint on the surface. But you have to build it up more carefully. You have to layer it up with less water, which again suits my style of painting. I'll use sort of strokes rather than big areas of wet to build up saturation, so working quite dry, small strokes. It gives me a lot more control doing it like that as well, because I can then work into the grade into the highlights without going over them with too much water. Too much water is actually the enemy. When you add in more saturated colour to it, you really don't want a lot of water. You just want to dampen in order to build that colour up into the highlights. So I'm kind of at the stage here with this one where that's what I'm starting to do, is sort of build up the saturation of colour. And this paper is very good for that saturation of colour with this red. I find if it's anything too heavy and dark that requires a lot of work, and it can be a bit more problematical. But I think I need to work on it a little bit more, and before sort of making a final decision on how much I like this paper or not. But at the moment it's performing really quite well. So I'll stop there with it. So just recapping over the strengths and weaknesses, there was the clean edges are really good on this paper. You get lovely sharp clean edges. The washes, it dries off a little bit fast, so you have to work quickly or work quite selectively. Big washes I think would be more of an issue. I haven't really done any huge washes on it, so I don't know for certain. The surface doesn't raise up and it's been wet, it stays fairly smooth, so you can still paint those sharp lines where you might need them around the edge of things or getting into areas. The build-up of colour is pretty good, but you do have to be careful that you don't use too much water because it'll start to shift the paint underneath. So all in all, I think it's a pretty good paper, but I'm quite happy to use. So the next paper I'm going to try out is the Saunders Waterford, which I also use quite a lot, and that's got quite a different feel to it. But again, it's a good paper, but I'm going to compare the two and see what comes out best.